Will my practice have a higher valuation in the RIA model? That is today's question on the Transition to RIA Question and Answer series. It is episode number 105. Hi, I'm Brad Wales with Transition to RIA, where I help you understand everything there is to know about why and how to transition to the RIA model. If you're not already there, if you head on over to transitiontoria.com, you can find all of the resources I make available from this entire series in video format, podcast format. I have articles, I have white papers, all kinds of things to help you better understand the RIA model. Again, transitiontoria.com. Okay, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about if you were to move into the RIA model, would your practice have a higher valuation essentially for at the end of your career when you're looking for that liquidity event? And this kind of comes back to one of the things I often bring up early when I'm having conversations with advisors that are looking into this RIA model or exploring it, and say, hey, what are your motivations for taking a look at this? Let's make sure you have the right motivations. Let's make sure the RIA model would satisfy whatever those motivations are. And no matter how it's phrased and or how it's articulated, those answers generally fall into one of two buckets, and often advisors are seeking them both. It's usually a desire for more flexibility with their practice, how they can run their practice, the services they can provide for their clients, how the investment solutions they can use, those sorts of things. And so flexibility is kind of a big bucket. And then the other big bucket is economics. And so that falls into current day income, seeking better economics currently than whatever your affiliation model or firm you're at now is. And then also the enterprise value of your practice down the road at the end of your career, which even if you're quite a long ways off, you always want to be thinking about that, because this is your life's work. You're putting in all these years, possibly decades of your time and effort. You want to be able to get the most value for everything you've built out. And so that's what another motivation for the RIA model, again, on that economic front, is that higher valuation. And so what we're going to be talking about in today's episode is, well, why do practices typically have a higher valuation in the RIA model? That's what we're going to dive into here today. So a couple thoughts along that front. The first one is, just by nature alone of you maybe transitioning your practice into the RIA model. When I say transition into the model, and as I've talked about on several episodes, that might be starting your own RIA. For some of you, that might make sense. For others, it may be more advantageous to join an existing RIA. There's some flavors in the middle that you could consider as well. But no matter how you get there, the idea is, okay, well, once you're in that, are you going to have, the higher valuation? But by nature of the fact that you're even going down any of those paths, your practice currently or your planned future state is that you're either predominantly, if not entirely, fee-based. Now, as I've said multiple times, it is sometimes a misunderstanding that you do not have to be 100% fee-based to go into the RIA model. There are ways to accommodate, often thought of as legacy commission business. Maybe you're not desiring to do new commission business, but perhaps you are sitting on a fair size amount of, often the case is variable annuities that make sense for the client to stay in those positions. Those positions are paying you a trail. Maybe you're saying, hey, I'm not going to do any more of that going forward, or if I am going to use variable annuities, I'm going to use fee-based versions of it, but I do have that position. I've done episodes on how you can solve for that essentially in the RIA model. But the idea being that your practice is predominantly, and when I say predominantly, 67 to 80% or more fee-based. So just that alone will drive a higher valuation for your practice. Now, yes, you will still get that same dynamic no matter what kind of model you're in or affiliation arrangement, or you should at least, that a practice tilted more towards the fee-based client is always going to have a higher valuation. It just is what it is. When valuations are run, there's a higher multiple put on that reoccurring revenue of the fee-based relationship versus the transactional commission-based relationship. So just that alone, the fact that you even essentially are a good candidate to go in the RIA model, means you are already predominantly, if not entirely, fee-based, or that's where you're moving your practice. that alone will increase the valuation of your practice. And again, you can experience that in other affiliation models as well. But certainly it's a sign when you get into the RIA space. And that in part is why the constant for years now, the flow of advisors, as I say, the river only goes in one direction towards more and more independence, is why advisors are going down that path of the RIA model, because they are choosing to become, for whatever their motivations, increasingly fee-based practice. The RIA model was built to accommodate that sort of advisor. So that's kind of number one, is just know the more fee-based you get your practice, it is what it is. The higher multiples, the higher enterprise value you are going to have at the end when you go to have some sort of liquidity event. So now next up, I kind of want to talk about how some other affiliation models or arrangements compare from that on that enterprise value to what you might be able to accomplish in the RIA space. So for starters, we'll take the traditional wirehouse firms. You could also put W-2 regional firms in this. So we're kind of putting a broad bucket, but we're essentially talking about that W-2 employee model. And if you ride out your career at those models and then go to exit, they typically have programs. They usually all call them something different, a little fancy name. They're more informally referred to as sunset plans, where the idea being that if I am essentially the advisor that's near in retirement, I have hopefully orchestrated this kind of years-long sunset plan. I have found a junior advisor or advisors or team or whatever the case is that's going to essentially absorb my practice, and I'm going to, over a series of years, hand that practice off to them, and I will be compensated for that. And so again, they're called different things, but that's essentially the sunset plan. So some of the challenges of the sunset plan compared to what you can do in the RIA space is, number one, you are just naturally going to get a lower valuation for your practice if you're just saying, hey, I'm just going to sit tight where I am, and I'm only the only potential dance partners, if you will, the only potential quote unquote buyers of the practice are going to be people at my same firm. And by the way, my firm is going to orchestrate this whole arrangement. And so that creates some challenges. As far as a valuation goes, you have now shrunk the pool of who could essentially put a potential valuation on your practice. So typically the firms will either have some sort of formula that is used of how this is calculated out, or maybe you negotiate some with whoever the kind of the receiving advisor or advisors is going to be. But you have now a much smaller pool of essentially buyers than you would in the RIA space, where you can go out to the entire marketplace. And so just an analogy, because I love using analogies, imagine you own a home and you're in the neighborhood, and two kind of analogies we could use on this front. Imagine, first of all, you want to go sell it, and you have to rely on the HOA, which is the equivalent of the wirehouse firm, the HOA telling you what valuation you can get for your house and how that process is going to play out for you to sell your house. They get to decide that. They dictate to you. You got to play by their rules. And then kind of another analogy along with that is the same neighborhood is, imagine even if you had a little more flexibility, but that you could the only people that could maybe show interest in your house or bid on your house are people that live in your neighborhood. Now, yes, there might be some other good homeowners there that are looking to buy an additional house, buy a different house, buy a larger house, whatever the case is, but you've now shrunk the pool. That's just economics 101. If you're going to have a smaller pool of potential people to bid on your house versus going out to the marketplace and say, hey, whoever's qualified, come on in, take a look, place your bid, let's see what sort of value you put on the house. That is going to artificially constrict the price in our analogy of your house. Same thing if you're at that wirehouse firm. You're either forced to use a valuation from the firm, or you've at least at a minimum restricted the number of potential buyers you have. And so that's going to artificially lower the price versus going out freely in the market in the RIA space. But let's say you can even get past that. Another thing you have to consider is the taxation on the money that you will receive. And so typically, again, in that W-2 wirehouse space or regional space, as the retiring advisor, typically how that's structured is that you are essentially paid over a number of years on a decrease in scale of the production of the practice. as you are essentially no longer working at that point, but you're still being paid. And that's typically taxed at those W-2 rates, the personal income tax rates. And for some of you that have built a large practice, even at that decline in scale, you will still be in a high tax bracket. Compare that to in the RIA space when you sell a practice, you can typically structure that so that most of that transaction will be taxed to you as the seller at capital gains. So I say most, you typically can't get all of it, but most of it taxed at a capital gains tax rate, which is generally always lower than whatever personal income tax rate you might be in. So taxes alone can make a difference on that front, even if somehow we could say the valuation would be the same, which the point I gave prior, I argue will not be the case. But even if it was the case, the taxation difference alone could dramatically move that needle. So you need to run those numbers. So for some of you with a larger practice, just the taxation alone could essentially be hundreds of thousands of dollars in difference of what you ultimately will put in your pocket. So something very important to consider. And then the final kind of thought with that wirehouse model, and as always, these are not in all-inclusive lists or doesn't list everything out there. But typically, if you enter one of these sunset programs, now as the retiring advisor, you may be less directly worried about this, but the receiving advisor or advisors, so the recipients, the junior advisors, whatever you want to call them, they of course have to enter into this sunset program. It's a formal program. It's in writing, provided a document created by your firm. Oftentimes, the language of those agreements will now handcuff that junior advisor for what they can do in the future. For sure, typically during that actual sunset period, the number of years that it is involved in the actual essentially buyout, and that's understandable to a degree because of the economics and you getting paid or whatnot. But some of that language can still be restrictive even after that sunset program is gone, and now depends on what they want to do with the practice, which is now going to be their practice. In the future, you've potentially put additional handcuffs on them that would make it harder for them to ever leave that firm, leave that model if they ever desired to. So as the retiring advisor, that won't impact you as directly because, hey, that's essentially not going to be your problem one day. But I think it is fair to consider that and consider what ramifications that could have on the receiving advisor as well. So something to keep in mind on that front. Okay, now a little pivot to the independent broker-dealer model. And so here you have a little more flexibility, right, than that sunset program. For the most part, again, you're independent. You can go out there, you can sell your practice. But two kind of issues with going to sell your practice. Most of the big buyers out there are the large RIAs, the large aggregators, wherever the case is. And let me back up real quick. I should have said this at the top. Everything shouldn't be about money, right? So I don't want this episode to come across as, oh, the only thing you should care about is how to get every last penny out of your practice, and it's all about making as much money as you can. I don't want that to be or at least perceived as the message I'm trying to give. Now, the reality is you're doing this. This is a for-profit operation. You're doing this to build a business, to build your life's work, to benefit from that on the tail end for all your hard work, your years and decades of hard work, to be paid for that. So absolutely you deserve to be paid for it. But I do get where, okay, we don't necessarily need to do every last little path that squeezes every last little dollar. There are other considerations, how it might impact your clients, how it might impact your team members. So I should have said that at the top. I'm not naive to the fact that there's other variables involved, but the purpose of this episode is to talk about how to drive that higher valuation. And then ultimately, that's one of the pieces that you would want to put into your consideration mix as to how you eventually exit the business. So sorry, I got off on a sidebar there, but I thought that was important to address. So back in the independent broker-dealer space, again, we're saying, like I just kind of covered, hey, we're trying here to say what would it take to get that higher enterprise value? Well, essentially the largest buyers out there are RIAs out there that are buying practices. So if you are still in a independent broker-dealer space, one of two things are going to, while you have more flexibility than that W-2 advisor, one of two things are going to still kind of hold your valuation down. typically the easiest transaction for you might be to find a buyer at your firm because that buyer is already there. That buyer is already used to the systems at that firm. The firm will help facilitate it. Your clients are aware of the story of who this firm is. And so there could be some interest in going that route. And if you're at a large broker-dealer, there could be essentially thousands of advisors, so a fairly large pool. But again, you are still limiting that pool versus the grander, the entire marketplace of who could be a buyer, who could drive that higher valuation. And even if you're at a broker-dealer that has thousands of advisors, excuse me, they're not necessarily, or they're not at all in your area and or able to accommodate buying a practice in your area, whereas there's larger buyers out there that can come in and build that infrastructure there at a local basis to be a buyer. So even in the independent broker-dealer space, you are going to limit your amount of buyers some either way. And then if you say, well, yeah, but I'm independent and I can sell my practice to whoever I want, which is correct, but you might say, well, and I'll even sell it to one of those RIA buyers. But if you are still in that independent broker-dealer model, when you go to do that, that buyer now has two variables they have to factor. One, they have to extract you with it's going to be you're going to have to help do it anyways. If they buy, they are going to extract you out of that firm anyways. They want you under their RA and the assets that traditional custodians that they are already using. And if you're not already there, they will have to extract you out of the model you're at now. And so naturally, that's more work for them. That's more uncertainty for them. So they are not going to give you as high of a valuation as opposed to if you had already done that work and you're already on the other side, you are already your assets at some custodian or custodians. So you have to factor that in, that they would have to extract you out. And there's the uncertainty that you say, hey, I have X million in assets. And oh, yes, hey, come in here and yes, help me extract myself out of here. Well, they don't know for sure how much of the assets will follow you, right? That's anytime there's a transition, there's always the question of, okay, what assets do you have now? What are your relationships like with your clients? Let's try to estimate how much of those assets will move with you. And typically for most transition advisors, it's the overwhelming majority of client assets do follow them, but there's always some that doesn't. So whether that's the advisor chooses to leave it behind, you do have some clients, maybe by surprise, maybe not surprise, decide to stay behind. Maybe you have some smaller clients that you just as well leave behind. And so that buyer has some uncertainty of, okay, well, how much is actually going to move? So they are going to have to give you a lower valuation on that because they have to factor that in, that this might not be as valuable as they think it is. Whereas if you had already extracted yourself out of there, gone into the RA model, there would be that certainty. They would know exactly what they're buying. So that is going to essentially kind of bring down those valuations as well if you're in that independent broker-dealer space. So you're better in the independent broker-dealer space than you are in that captive W-2 space from a valuation or enterprise value situation, but still you still have some of those constraints. And so I think it's just important to think about how this differs, whereas in the RIA space, when you're out there, you can go out there, whether you are your own RIA or if you've joined the right kind of RIA that says, hey, at the end of the day, this is your book of business, this is your practice for you to monetize. And because you're already with custodians, again, you don't have that issue. Even though a buyer might extract you out of that RIA, they're not having to move the assets. And so that's a completely different situation and opportunity for a potential buyer. And so I hope you can understand where in the RIA space, you're just going to have significantly more flexibility of who you could sell to, what that sort of transaction looks like. And related to that, the final point I want to make is when you go through, so again, this is monetary. I keep talking about valuations. But another thing to consider, particularly those of you that are in some sort of path that would involve that sunset plan, is if you were to go through that, that is a very kind of defined process that the firm says, okay, hey, if retire an advisor, if you're going to go through the sunset plan, and okay, we've identified whoever the essentially acquirer is, an advisor or team, and however that valuation's been worked through, we talked about that earlier. But the reality is then that firm says, okay, and here's the process for that. In year one, this is what's going to be essentially the payout split. In year two, this is what's going to be. In year 3, by the way, advisor, you now have to leave at this point, and the payout goes to here. In year 4 or 5, whatever the case is, it's a prescribed process that the firm puts in place, and you have to sign off and follow it. Now, you might like whatever they've put in place, and obviously they've attempted to come up with something that they think advisors will like. I mean, they're not out just to make things difficult, but that's the process. In the RIA space, even if you put the valuation aside, when you are out there in the marketplace and you're going to sell, you essentially have complete flexibility on terms that you want to exit under. Now, you have to find a dance partner, you have to find a buyer that agrees with those terms, but there's no prescribed way you have to do it. And so that's impacts a couple things, both how the actual transaction occurs. So is some amount up front, is some amount deferred, over what intervals is it paid out, how long does it take from start to finish for you to receive that entire valuation? You have complete flexibility to negotiate that. Now, there's some kind of industry standards and kind of ways you might start that conversation, but you don't have to just say, oh, here's the rule book, here's the sunset rule book, that's all you get. You can negotiate that and try to come up with something that works for both you, and of course the buyer has to agree to it, but it's a seller's market out there. So yes, you can't just ask for anything and necessarily expect to get it, but you have a lot more control of saying, okay, here's what's going to work for me on that economics standpoint. Then on the non-monetary part of it is how you plan to exit, when you plan to step away, how long you want to stay on after the transaction. Now, a buyer will naturally, hopefully, if you found the right buyer, they absolutely will want you to stay on for some period of time to help with essentially the transition, to help with the client handoffs, to help make sure the clients are comfortable with the new arrangement, the new team, whatever the case is. And so they will want you to stay on. But again, when you're in the flexibility of the RA space, you can negotiate that. So I've seen some advisors that say, hey, I'm at the end of my career. I get you need me to stay around. Let's pack it into 6 months. I'll do everything we need to do in that 6 months. And then I'm stepping away. Others say, hey, I'm ready to get the certainty of the transaction done. But I still feel good, and I could do this another 2-3 years. And so I realized we're going to have to figure out, how I'm going to be paid over those 2-3 years. But I would like to stay on that long. And again, you got to get the buyer to agree to it as well. But you have that flexibility. Again, that's dramatically different than having to use a forced prescribed rule book that your firm has set for you. Say this is essentially the only way you can do it. So just know, not just better economics selling in the RA model, much more flexibility of how you actually exit the business, which for some of you is very important. I've seen advisors that they're just done. They're ready to move on. They don't want a 2, 3, 4, 5-year runway. They know they need something, and it might be 6 months. It'd be hard to do it much shorter than that. And then there's others that do want to stay on for a long time. But likewise, I've also seen buyers, and some buyers say, hey, no, we don't want an advisor staying on for 5 years. We want to absorb the new practice and integrate it into our team. And at some point, it is right for the advisor to then step away. So again, you got to get both sides to agree to it. But again, as I keep saying, much more flexibility to negotiate both the economics and the terms of what you do it under. So this has not been an exhaustive list of every element that goes into the valuation of a practice under both a captive environment versus the RA space, but just at a high level, I hope this has helped you understand why generally in every circumstance, you're just going to have higher valuation and generally more flexibility with your practice when you go to sell it, you go for that liquidity event at the end of your career. It just generally is always going to be higher there at the end. But as I said on my sidebar in the middle, I get money's not everything. You do want to factor in, perhaps you've been nurturing an internal junior advisor for some time, and you're at some current firm now, and you are even willing to accept a lower valuation and accept less flexibility because this is an alignment that you've had now going for years, and you've committed to this person that you are going to essentially sunset with them, even for less money. You might be willing to do that. That's a personal decision. That's for you to decide. And I totally get where that situation does happen. I know people that are on both ends of that where that happens. But but it is also hard when there are valuations that are oftentimes significantly higher that you could achieve in a different direction. That's for you to decide, but it is just important to understand why it is different in the RIA space than maybe where you're at now. Understand it fully and then decide if that's for you. But this hopefully at least helps you understand another reason you should maybe be considering, if you're not already in the RIA model, going down that path, whether you got 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years left in your practice. One of the variables that you will achieve by going that RIA space is that better scenario for that enterprise value at the end of your practice. So even if you got a long runway ahead, at some point, you'll want to likely make that transition. So with that, like I said at the top, my name is Brad Wales with Transition to RIA. This is the sort of thing I help advisors with, is understand, hey, is the RIA model even right for me? Does my practice profile fit it? And by the way, if I were to make a move into it, what am I going to gain from doing so? And so again, that comes back to that flexibility bucket, the economics bucket. Part of that economics bucket is the enterprise value, like we're talking about today. Happy to have that conversation with you to learn more about how this would apply to your specific practice. But first things first, head on over to transition2ria.com, where you can find all of the resources I make available to help you better understand the RIA model. Again, this entire series in video format, podcast format. I have articles, I have white papers, and then at the top of every page is a contact link. You click on that, you can instantly and easily schedule time to have a one-on-one conversation with me, whether you want to talk about today's topic or anything else RIA related. I'm happy to have that conversation with you. Again, transition2ria.com. And with that, I hope you found value in today's episode, and I'll see you on the next one.